First, a warning. This video contains content that some viewers may well find shocking, disturbing, and upsetting. So, I do advise that you proceed with caution. "Shut that dog up," Joseph said, hissing through his teeth. After all, he didn't want to draw much attention. That dog did keep barking. You would have thought Joseph was in the Home Army, the way he lorded it over you. He was only 17, a grey rank just like you, but he did have slightly more experience of situations like these, slightly more, and I suppose that gave him the edge over you. You are 2 years younger. But that dog, this dog, he's been a friend of yours for the last month, since you dug him out of the rubble of the ghetto. He's been a good luck charm. He's looked out for you, you've looked out for him, and there he is now, happily looking up at you, tail wagging, tongue hanging, eyes looking into yours. He barks again, quite happily. You try and stroke him to calm him, and he yaps. Joseph shoots you a glare. You know that it's dangerous. You know that having a dog around, something you can't control, the volume, is very much dangerous, especially given your current situation in a cellar of a bombed out house. You've been in this place now for 2 whole days, no food, no water. Things are starting to look a little desperate, but the Germans outside haven't moved. They are setting up a little camp, it would seem. Are they aware you are there? Are they toying with you? Are they just regrouping before another assault on Old Town? It's very, very difficult to say, and right now things are feeling slightly edgy. The dog barking isn't helping, especially as it does it again. Joseph comes over to you, puts his hand on your arm, and he says, "If you will not shut that dog up, I will." You know that he's sad. You can tell from the tone of his voice. You've been through a lot with Joseph. You know when he's sad about having to give such an edict. And you know that he's right. You know that this dog could give your position away. And you can't have that. You've lost too many people. You don't want to lose this one. You think of the dog as a person. You're his friend. But you've lost so many friends already. The dog barks. It looks up at you happily. You look down at it sadly. Joseph closes his eyes as he knows what you're about to do. Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming and my review of Grey Ranks. Now, Grey Ranks is a unique kind of a game because of its emotional gravitas. Now, Grey Ranks isn't necessarily something about animal cruelty or anything like that. Far from it. In fact, the reason I used a dog in that intro sequence, that little bit of narrative, is because I know that animals and harm coming to animals can deeply upset people. And this is a game that can deeply upset people. And sometimes, because of the common nature of role-playing games dealing with human mortality as if it were nothing, many games deal with death and violence as if it's par for the course. Sometimes you need something that feels a little more localised, a little more domestic, in order to shock and appall. And Grey Ranks does that, but not in a way that makes me think, "Ugh, I need to put this book down." It does it with gravitas, it does it with weight, it does it with emphasis on all the right points. Now, to give a bit of background, Grey Ranks is a game that is more of a storytelling game, collaborative storytelling game. You need no GM. It is by Bully Pulpit Games, same people who did Fiasco, and you may well see some similarities in all of this. And it is set during the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, during World War II. Now, you may not be familiar with the Warsaw Uprising. It's often overlooked due to the Ghetto Uprising, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. A lot of people are familiar with that because the Holocaust is rightly quite well known. But in 1944, the Polish resistance, the Home Army, fought back against the Nazi machine. And amazingly, probably to themselves just as much as the Nazis and everyone else, they did remarkably well. For 2 months, they held parts of Warsaw completely liberated, free from Nazi rule. Many parts of the city went about life as if they had never been occupied in the first place. The opera was on, the postal service ran, people were actually living lives. And that's because of the fierce fighting of the resistance on the edges and the German inability to do much about it. Now, the reason for their resistance at that time was because they knew the Soviets were coming. The Home Army had been in contact with the Soviets, at least to a limited degree, and the Soviets were 100 kilometres away, and they stopped. Soviets didn't come any further, and the reasons for that are debated to this day. Some claim that the Soviets didn't actually have the manpower or machinery to completely take Warsaw from the Germans, and it wouldn't have been a particularly tactically sound place to hold a position. Others, more cynical perhaps, but maybe correct, believe that Stalin, in himself, or at the very least the Kremlin, instructed that no one was to advance any further towards Warsaw until after the resistance fell. Now, why was this? Well, the resistance, the Home Army, were quite keen on installing themselves as government, showing that Poland could be led by Poles, because they didn't want Soviet rule any more than they wanted Nazi rule. Yes, there were some Polish communists, but the majority were very much for a free Poland, free from any form of tyranny. And the Soviets were aware of this, Stalin was aware of this, and he wanted Warsaw and the rest of Poland to become part of the USSR at the end of the Second World War, which was fast approaching. So, by giving them aid, he could potentially validate their claim, and he didn't want that. He even restricted aid by American and British. They couldn't use Russian airstrips. They would be shot at if they flew over Soviet airspace. And so the Americans and British who were attempting to help the Polish out, and the Polish Air Force for that matter, who were in exile in Britain, would have to fly all the way from Italy simply to drop some meagre air supply, well, airdrops on Warsaw, most of which didn't meet their targets, and many of them landed in Nazi hands, unfortunately. And many of the pilots who performed these missions died. So, all of this content, all of this history is dealt with in this book. This is a hopeless situation. It is not a setting in which you are expected to win the war, to turn the tide, to actually lead to a free Poland. That isn't the point of this game. The point is playing these grey ranks. The grey ranks were the 15 to 17-year-olds who worked for the Home Army, or the Resistance, rather, because they could work for the People's Army as well to a degree. They weren't allowed to fight because they weren't 18. The Resistance had strict rules about this, but they could perform other tasks. They could deliver messages, they could perform acts of sabotage, they could graffiti Nazi flags, they could disrupt the Nazi war machine. In some rare cases, they performed assassinations. But the grey ranks, largely dominated by 15 to 17-year-olds, were boys and girls who wanted to take part in the battle to free Poland, and of course lived the most dynamic 2 months of a 15 to 17-year-old's life. Well, that's probably on record at the time. I'm sure, well, I say that, there's a lot of other resistances that had the exact same thing, but we're focusing on the Warsaw Resistance here, the Grey Ranks, because that is the name of the game. And that is who you are playing. You are all playing a member of these Grey Ranks, these scouts, both girls and boys. And whether you take on the role of a 15-year-old who is dominated by his enthusiasm, wanting to bloody the Nazi nose, or a 17-year-old who's a bit more bitter and cynical about all of that, can see the end coming, but desperately wants to get laid or express his love before the end of his life, which he can see approaching. There is an awful lot of room in which to explore the fast lives of these people, fast and tragic lives of these characters. A lot of players I've spoken to about this have felt they couldn't do the history justice, but I don't think that's true. Grey Ranks as a game actually has a great deal of tools within it to allow you to explore these kinds of things. And it isn't just a game about misery. It isn't just a game about futility and about pathos or anything like that. It's a game about the highs and lows of teenage life. The highs of the first time you have sex. The highs of the excitement of attacking the enemy of your people. Through to the lows of losing a friend. The lows of being lined up against a wall. The lows of losing your first lover or your family, or having to help people escape, or not knowing what's happened to those you love. So it deals with extremes of emotion, and I would quite happily say that this game could not be for everyone as a result. People who are less emotionally stable, to use a somewhat harsh term, could have difficulties with Grey Ranks, just as they have difficulties with games like Wraith the Oblivion and other such heavy subject matter. It's not necessarily something to be entered lightly, and so the book in fact encourages that you set lines at the beginning of the game. Animal cruelty, if that's off the board. Sex scenes, are they off the board? Outright violence against children, is that off the board? You can of course set all of this up. The game itself works in not a dissimilar way to Fiasco in that everyone gets scenes. The game itself is divided up between 10 chapters. The first and 10th chapters kind of acting like prologues and epilogues. The prologue being there to really allow you to develop your character. This is just before the uprising starts, where you can suffer no losses essentially for your actions and really hone the sort of character you're playing. And the epilogue kind of being like the montage scene at the end of Fiasco, allowing you to describe exactly what happens to you. But the rest of the game is divided up between these other chapters that are all prefaced by Radio Lightning, which was the resistance radio in Warsaw at the time. The script from Radio Lightning is in the book, what the the DJ was broadcasting essentially. And from those bulletins, essentially you can craft each chapter's plot. What are your mission objectives going to be? What are your personal objectives going to be? And every character, every player gets to throw in a situation as well that is determined by your character's place on the grid. The grid is probably the most important mechanical piece of this game. You see it there. Now the grid is where your characters start. Your characters actually start around the middle, depending on the emotion that they are closest to. Maybe they are closest to love or hate or enthusiasm or exhaustion. And depending on the die rolls, because there is dice rolling in this, you may well get closer and closer at the end of every mission and personal objective. You may get closer to one of these corner spaces. The corner spaces, for instance, having such wonderful terms as suicidal depression, nervous breakdown, derangement, and martyrdom. If you pass through the same corner space twice during the course of the 10 chapters, because you've been rolling these dice, and it isn't completely random because you get to choose which dice you're putting into the pool, then your character is on the way out. The next scene your character is in, you have to basically narrate, you have to roleplay the end for that character. That doesn't mean they necessarily die. Maybe they just get bundled into the back of a van and you never see them again. Maybe they escape. Whatever the case, it has to somehow fit in with the, I suppose, conclusion that is noted in that corner piece. And as you're approaching the sides of the board, that is dictating the way in which you should be playing your character. It is essentially pushing you in certain directions. You're getting these pressures. So the closer and closer you get to, let's say, love and nervous breakdown, well, you may well want to incorporate elements of both of those things in your storytelling. As I say, it is a game that carries an awful amount of emotional weight. It isn't Fiasco in the sense that it is completely, well, free and easy and should be amazingly fun and humorous, because that's typically what Fiasco is. This is a game that may well upset people. But I don't think it's wrong for that to be the case. I think that given the subject matter, it's one of the rare games that treats war like war ought to be treated, that violence has consequences, whether it's violence you perpetrate or violence perpetrated against you. For instance, you may well kill someone in a scene. In one of the example scenes, one of the player's characters beats a Nazi spotter next to a sniper to death and keeps on beating him, and is basically getting closer and closer to nervous breakdown because of the mania of the situation. The likelihood is, as the game goes on, your characters are going to get closer and closer to one edge or another, or back towards an edge you've visited before, and again, pass through that corner more than once and you are unfortunately toast by one means or another. Is Grey Ranks a good game? I would say yes, but I aim in my games to evoke an emotional reaction. That is my raison d'etre, I suppose. Okay, you can play games just to have fun, and I do run games just so people can have fun as well. But my point is, I want to run scenes that make people happy, I want to run scenes that make people angry, upset, appalled, shocked, horrified, because, depending on the genre, amazed, you know. I want my games to actually make the players sit back and think about what's going on. And that's a fairly lofty aim from 3 or 4 hours, and you can play this in one session. This is perfect for conventions. Grey Ranks is a perfect game for that kind of emotional reaction. You could very well get a group of role players together who really feel like they've shared something. Is it fun? It's good, yes, but is it fun? Is it fun to explore your emotions? That's going to differ from player to player. It really is. I can't say hand on heart that everyone that plays this is going to enjoy this. I think Fiasco has kind of got that covered. Even people who are reticent about Fiasco, typically, whilst they're in play, suddenly realise the amount of power they've got, the amount of fun they can have, and Fiasco often turns into one of their favourite role-playing experiences. Grey Ranks, I think the subject matter is too weighty for some people. Some people don't like to handle that kind of thing, and whether it is the violence of it, whether it's the fact that you're playing children, which is an intrinsic part of the setting and intrinsic part of the emotional range that you can go through in this game, whether it's merely the matter of sex, given that you are playing 15 to 17-year-olds, in some states and some countries the legal age of consent is 18, and therefore it may feel uncomfortable to be playing emotionally charged, sexually charged characters. But again, I would argue that is part of the game. I think when you can see your death just around the corner, everything is stimulated to a peak, and you need to vent, whether it's through anger or love or lust or whatever. So is it a fun game? It is for the right players, but I think people that think that it wouldn't be a good game for them are probably right. I would go that far to say. However, I would say that it is a game that's written with reverence, with deference, and good reference as well to the situations on which it is based. There's plenty of historical fact in here. There are quotes from various characters of the time, shall we say. Hans Frank, I don't know if he's ever been referred to, oh, what a character Dr. Frank was. There are little biographies of real members of the Grey Ranks, which just go to show that a 15 to 17-year-old is far from useless in a theatre of resistance. I wouldn't really call what happened to these people war as much as, well, mass murder. It is a game that will make you think, and I don't think anyone that could play this could, at the end of it, forget this game. I think that you would play through this, and of all the role-playing that you have ever done, you would look back on your experience with Grey Ranks and be able to remember exactly what your character went through, from the giddy, exciting times when you were just painting rude words on the sides of Nazi tanks, to the point where your family are missing, your best friend just killed himself, the war machine is knocking down the walls and destroying all of Warsaw, you are the only one that is left. What are you going to do now? That's not the kind of thing you forget as a role player, and in some cases that is a wonderful thing, to be able to have a character or have played in a scene, partly of your own creation, where you can just think back and remember it all acutely. So for that reason, I think a game like Grey Ranks is the kind of reason indie games are so popular right now. It is a very, very good game. If it interests you in the slightest, it is at a very reasonable price on Drive-Thru RPG. Thank you very much for watching.